Scary deep woods stories. The house at Black Hollow Road. In the dead silence of a humid summer night in rural Pennsylvania, far from the city's lights and nestled at the edge of dense woods, thick with whispering trees, stood the abandoned structure locals only referred to as the house at Black Hollow Road, a place no one visited and everyone feared, a decaying monument to something forgotten, yet still breathing, still watching. And when 29-year-old Rebecca Hart, a freelance documentary filmmaker with a fascination for American haunted folklore, arrived in town to investigate the mysterious disappearances tied to the house. She didn't believe the warnings, didn't heed the subtle fear in the gas station clerk's eyes, or the fact that the sheriff had crossed himself twice when she mentioned her destination, because she had visited countless derelict locations across the country and had never encountered anything more than creaking boards and wind pushing through broken windows. But this place, this house, was different from the moment she pulled up in her rental car at 6:27 p.m., when the sun was beginning to die behind the horizon and a low mist curled unnaturally around the rotting porch, clinging to the pillars like fingers desperate to hold on. And even though the building had clearly been uninhabited for decades, its windows were all unbroken, intact yet impossibly dark, as if the glass refused to let light through, as if something inside was absorbing it, devouring it. And as she stepped out, camera in hand, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that the house had already noticed her. Her already decided something about her fate. But she pressed on, eager to capture footage before nightfall. And once inside, the air changed, the temperature dropping with such intensity her breath plumed before her, and the silence became unnatural, thick, as if the house had swallowed every sound she made. The wood beneath her feet groaning, not in protest but in hunger, and as she scanned the wide, dust-covered parlor with its ancient fireplace and shattered chandelier hanging precariously from a ceiling riddled with mold, she began narrating into her mic, detailing the house's lore, that in 1974, the Miller family, a couple and their two children, had bought the property but vanished without a trace 2 months later, their belongings left untouched, their dog found mutilated in the backyard, and that over the years, 5 other squatters, thrill-seekers, and vagabonds had attempted to sleep in the house, only to either vanish or turn up days later, incoherent, eyes gouged out, mouths stitched shut, institutionalized until their deaths. But it wasn't until Rebecca entered the hallway, her flashlight flickering as she stepped near the base of the stairs, that she heard the first sound, a dragging noise, faint but deliberate, coming from upstairs, too steady to be a rat or falling debris. And when she looked up, the stairs stretched into darkness deeper than her beam could penetrate. So she paused, adrenaline tightening her chest as instinct urged her to leave, to run. Yet the rational part of her brain clung to skepticism, insisting it was just the wind or an animal. And so she climbed, one creaking step at a time, each one echoing longer than it should, until she reached the second floor, where the air reeked of sulfur and rot, and a series of portraits hung along the hallway wall, each one depicting the same family, the Millers. But in each frame, their expressions grew more contorted, their eyes darker, mouths wider, as if they were slowly transforming into something inhuman. And Rebecca felt a pulse beneath the floorboards, like a heartbeat, like the house itself was alive. And then the dragging sound returned, louder, closer, accompanied by a wet, gasping breath, and she spun around just in time to see a figure vanish into one of the rooms ahead, a blur of white and black and red. So she followed, heart pounding, into what must have once been a child's room, where the walls were smeared with crayon drawings of stick figures without faces, and one wall bore a message in childish scrawl that read, "Daddy said the voices live in the walls." And as Rebecca scanned the room, something moved in her peripheral vision, a shape under the bed, pale and small, with fingers twitching in unnatural spasms. And when she leaned down, camera aimed, the figure shot out with inhuman speed, crawling not like a child, but like a spider, head twisted upside down, mouth hanging open wider than her jaw could fathom, letting out a shriek that pierced her skull and shattered her thoughts, causing her to stumble backward, dropping her flashlight, which flickered wildly as it rolled, casting dancing shadows across the walls. And in those shadows, she saw other figures watching, dozens of them, pressed against the wallpaper as if trapped behind it. Faces pushing out through the floral patterns, mouths moving in silent screams. And when she fled from the room and raced back downstairs, the house seemed to shift around her, the hallway elongating, stairs melting into the floor, her feet sinking into something soft and wet. And then she was back in the parlor, gasping, wild-eyed, and the front door was gone, replaced by solid wall. The windows now bricked up from the inside, and that's when she realized the house didn't want her to leave, that it had brought her here not to haunt her, but to keep her, to use her, to feed on her. And as her flashlight finally died and the room plunged into total blackness, she heard the voices whispering from all around her, calling her name with mouths that hadn't spoken in decades, and something cold touched the back of her neck, something that breathed into her ear and said, "We've been waiting for you, Rebecca." Rebecca's scream never left her throat, choked back by the overwhelming dread that washed over her in that moment, a primal fear that made her limbs seize and her lungs forget how to breathe as the voice, impossibly close, whispered again, slower this time, dragging her name across her ear like nails against bone. "Rebecca!" And then silence, suffocating and infinite, collapsed around her like a tomb, swallowing the last trace of light and warmth from the room, leaving only the thudding of her own heart, rapid and erratic, as she fumbled in the dark, hands trembling, searching the floor for the flashlight that had been her only anchor to sanity, her fingers brushing something slick, warm, pulsing, definitely not the flashlight, and she recoiled in horror, backing into what should have been the wall behind her, only to find it soft and breathing, the wallpaper shifting beneath her palms as if skin stretched too thin. And when she pressed back, it shuddered with a sigh, releasing a fetid gust of air that reeked of death and old earth. And then came the whispering again. Not one voice but hundreds, layered and overlapping, speaking in languages she couldn't recognize. Some hissing, some weeping, others laughing in jagged gasps that sounded too sharp, too broken to be human. And she spun blindly, disoriented, realizing the room had changed dimensions again, grown larger, wider, the ceiling taller, and something slithered along the edge of her vision, too quick to catch, too real to ignore, and just as panic threatened to break her mind, her hand finally landed on the flashlight, and she snapped it on, its weak beam slicing through the dark to reveal the room was no longer the parlor, but something else entirely. Something that looked like a basement, though she had never gone down any stairs, the walls made of damp stone, weeping crimson streaks, the floor dirt and bone, and in the center stood a circle etched in what looked like blood, with symbols Rebecca instinctively knew should never be read aloud. And within that circle knelt a child, or what resembled one, bald and gray-skinned, its limbs jointed the wrong way, eyes lidless and white, staring straight at her, and it smiled with a mouth that stretched from cheek to cheek, too wide, filled with teeth that were sharp and numerous and constantly shifting. And though it didn't move, Rebecca felt it reaching into her thoughts, plucking memories like petals from a flower. And in her mind she saw her mother's funeral, her first broken heart, her near drowning at age 10, all played out in vivid detail as the creature watched, feeding off her fear and pain. And it began to speak, but not with its mouth, with her own voice, mimicking her speech patterns perfectly. "You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have looked for them." And the flashlight flickered again as the symbols on the floor began to glow, casting pulsing red light that danced across the walls, revealing dozens of other figures clinging to the stone, embedded in it, moaning silently. Their eyes locked on her, pleading, accusing, and Rebecca stumbled back, desperate to escape the circle. But the moment she turned, the thing in the center screamed, a sound that made the walls vibrate, and blood pour from Rebecca's nose, and she collapsed, writhing, hands over her ears, screaming back in a voice she didn't recognize as her own. And then everything went black again. but not the kind of blackness that comes from darkness. It was a void, a total erasure of sensation, of thought, as if the house had swallowed her whole and was digesting her memories. Her identity, and when she awoke, she was no longer in the basement, but in a bedroom, pristine and untouched. Sunlight pouring through the window, birds chirping outside, and the house was quiet, too quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. And for a moment she believed she had hallucinated it all, until she turned and saw herself sitting on the bed. Herself, not a reflection, but a second Rebecca, wearing her clothes, holding her camera, smiling in that same unnatural way the child thing had smiled. And when the doppelganger looked up and spoke, it said, "I'm ready to take your place." And Rebecca couldn't move, couldn't scream, paralyzed as the other Rebecca stood, walked toward her, and reached out. And the moment their hands touched, pain unlike anything she had ever felt surged through her veins like fire and ice combined, and her vision blurred with faces. Faces of those who had come before, the Millers, the vagrants, the thrill seekers, all trapped, screaming inside her head. And she realized the house didn't just consume people, it copied them, wore them like skins, sending them back into the world to lure more souls. And now it was her turn. She was the bait. And as the doppelganger walked out of the room, out of the house, taking her place in the world, Rebecca was left behind, locked inside the house, staring into the mirror where her reflection no longer moved, no longer mimicked her expressions. And when she pounded on the glass, begging to be let out, the house simply laughed, a deep, guttural sound that shook the floor and rattled her bones. And then the door behind her creaked open slowly, revealing the child again, still smiling, still whispering, 13 souls for 13 rooms. And behind it, the hallway stretched on forever, doors lining each side, closed, waiting, and Rebecca knew. Each one held a person like her, a mind stolen, a body mimicked, and the house had only just begun to feed. Rebecca sat motionless in the chair of the antique bedroom, as dust floated through the narrow slits of sunlight, like ash in the aftermath of a quiet apocalypse. Her breath shallow, her thoughts fractured, her soul screaming behind a frozen exterior as the sound of footsteps faded down the hall. Her footsteps, or rather, the thing that wore her face, her body, her memories, now walking freely in the outside world, while she remained imprisoned in this waking nightmare that masqueraded as a house, a place that twisted space and time, that didn't just trap people, but unraveled them, rewrote them, replaced them. And now she was merely one reflection among countless others, her voice silenced, her presence hollow, her identity slipping further into the shadows with each passing moment as she stumbled from the chair and approached the hallway, its walls still pulsing faintly with the same reddish glow. Almost like the house itself was breathing, alive in the most unnatural of ways, feeding not on food or water, but on fear, identity, memory. And Rebecca realized the others, those faces she had seen, weren't just echoes. They were still here, watching, weeping, and screaming from behind the walls and mirrors. Every piece of furniture possibly a vessel. Every creak of the wood a whisper of a soul long devoured, and as she staggered past a doorway on her left, the knob twisted violently, as if something inside desperately wanted out. And for a moment she considered opening it, considered seeing who or what had been sealed behind it. But her gut screamed no, her instincts burning with alarm, and she pressed forward, deeper into the corridor that seemed to stretch and contract with every step, impossible to navigate, as if the house itself refused to be mapped or understood. And soon she found herself standing before a set of stairs that twisted downward into darkness again, impossibly steep and endless. And though she knew descending might mean falling further into the trap, she also sensed that whatever power controlled this house lived below, deep in its belly, in its original foundation, untouched by renovation or time. And so she began to walk, each step echoing with a hollow ring that didn't match the material beneath her, as if she were walking across bone rather than wood. And as she reached the bottom, the air thickened, became wet and metallic, filled with the scent of iron and rot, and a faint light pulsed ahead. Not electric, but bioluminescent, as though some ancient fungal growth had taken root in the walls. And in that greenish-blue gloom she saw them. Portraits, dozens of them, hanging crooked on the walls of a long subterranean hallway, all of them depicting people with terrified expressions, each painting more grotesque than the last, their eyes gouged out, their mouths sewn shut with black thread, and beneath each frame was a brass plate etched with names. Names that sent chills through her. Joseph Miller, Abigail Reed, Marcus Clay, Tessa Norman, and at the bottom of the row, Rebecca Monroe. Her name, her own face in the frame, painted in exact detail, except her eyes in the image were wide open, her mouth stretched unnaturally, screaming, and suddenly the lights flickered again, and she was no longer alone in the hallway, for shadows had gathered behind her, vague human shapes, eyeless and silent, their heads tilting at unnatural angles, twitching spasmodically like broken marionettes. And she turned, backing toward the wall, her breath ragged, heart pounding, when a voice, deep and guttural, not human but close enough to unnerve, rasped from the shadows. "You belong to the house now. The 13th. The vessel is filled." And Rebecca shook her head violently, refusing to accept it, and with a burst of adrenaline, she darted into the passage at the end of the hallway, the shadow figures surging after her with impossible speed, skittering across the ceiling and walls like insects, their limbs bending and snapping as they chased her. Their screams no longer human, but layered cries of all the souls they carried, all echoing with torment and confusion. And Rebecca burst into another chamber, circular and vast, with stone walls and a ceiling that disappeared into blackness. The floor carved with more of those symbols she dared not read. And in the center stood a massive mirror, ornate and cracked, its surface writhing as though it were made of water. And in its reflection she saw not herself but every person the house had taken, all screaming, some reaching toward her, others simply staring with hollow eyes. And then her reflection appeared, the fake Rebecca, standing behind her with a smile, and before she could turn, it lunged, passing through the mirror like a hand through water, slamming into her, knocking her back onto the floor, and they grappled not with fists but with thoughts, with memories. The fake trying to overwrite her again, its voice inside her head whispering, "Let me have it. Your face, your name, your love, your pain." But Rebecca screamed, not just in terror but in rage, a raw fury at being stripped of everything. And somehow, in that moment, she fought back, not with strength but with will, with every ounce of identity she still possessed, pushing back against the doppelganger, forcing it off her, and for a brief second, the mirror cracked deeper, splintering like ice under pressure, and the fake howled, retreating into the reflection as black veins crawled across its face, and then silence again, the chamber dimming, the air returning to a breathless stillness, and Rebecca staggered to her feet, blood dripping from her nose and ears, her vision doubled, her thoughts hazy, but she knew she had done something, cracked the shell, disturbed the order, and perhaps, just perhaps, she could find the heart of this thing and destroy it. And as she stepped closer to the mirror, the whispers returned, clearer this time, and one voice emerged from the chaos, a woman's voice calm and gentle but filled with sorrow. "Rebecca, find the root, the seed, the nursery, before it grows again." And before she could ask what that meant, the chamber began to tremble, the walls crumbling, the ground splitting, and the mirror exploded outward in a storm of glass and shrieks, and the floor gave way beneath her, and she fell, screaming into the dark again, not knowing where she would land, but knowing this was far from over, that the true horror was still hidden, festering, waiting to be found. Rebecca hit the ground hard. The wind knocked from her lungs as the darkness swallowed everything. The impact should have shattered her bones, but the surface she landed on felt soft, almost sponge-like, and warm, as if it were alive. The silence that followed was deeper than before, deeper than any normal silence, almost as if the world had been muted completely. She tried to sit up, her muscles trembling, her head spinning from the fall. All around her there was nothing but black, endless black. But when her fingers brushed the surface beneath her, it pulsed faintly, like the beat of a distant heart. She was inside the house still, or perhaps deeper now, inside its very body, its core. And then she heard it, a faint wailing sound far away, like a child crying, layered beneath wind that didn't move the air. She turned her head toward the sound, and slowly the blackness began to lighten. Shapes forming out of the void, jagged, broken architecture floating like bones in the dark. A hallway materialized in front of her, not connected to anything, just suspended in space like a floating spine. It was narrow, crooked, the walls pulsing faintly with that same reddish glow, now stronger, more vibrant. Rebecca stood, her legs unsteady, and began walking. As she did, the cries grew louder, clearer, and she realized they weren't just the cries of one child. They were dozens, hundreds, layered and twisted into one another like a symphony of anguish. The walls began to breathe around her, inflating and deflating with a sickening rhythm. And sometimes, within the pulsating plaster, she saw faces, eyes bulging, mouths wide in silent screams, pressing outward before dissolving back into the wall. She pressed on, her breath shallow, her mind fraying at the edges, until finally she reached a door at the end of the hallway, tall and narrow with no handle, just a keyhole that oozed black ichor. The cries were deafening here, the walls shaking violently, and as she approached the keyhole, something moved behind the door, a scratching sound, slow, methodical. She reached into her coat pocket on instinct and found a small key she didn't remember picking up. It was cold, almost frozen, carved from bone or something worse. Her hand trembled as she inserted it into the keyhole, and with a wet clicking noise, the door swung open. What lay beyond wasn't a room. It was a nursery, a long-forgotten, decaying nursery, lit by a dim, flickering bulb swaying above a rusted crib in the center. The walls were papered with faded cartoon animals, their eyes gouged out or melted, their smiles twisted into expressions of terror. The floor was covered in broken toys, blood-stained blankets, and symbols carved into the wood in a language she still couldn't read. The air reeked of mold, rot, and something far worse, suffering. In the crib lay a child. No, not a child, a bundle, wrapped in black cloth, motionless. Rebecca approached slowly, her instincts screaming to run. As she reached the crib, the bundle shifted. A tiny hand, too thin, too gray, too long, emerged from the cloth. And then the cloth fell away on its own. Inside was not a baby, but something malformed, human-like only in the vaguest way, its face a blank slate with dozens of tiny mouths twitching and gasping across its skin. It opened its eyes, dark, endless, mirror-like, and suddenly Rebecca was somewhere else, in a memory not hers. A woman screamed as she gave birth in a basement. Candles flickered. A man with no eyes chanted in a tongue long lost to time. Blood everywhere. The baby didn't cry. It laughed. A low, raspy giggle that sent everyone in the room reeling. Then darkness again, and Rebecca collapsed to her knees beside the crib, trembling, sweat pouring from her skin, as the thing in the crib whispered in a voice not meant for any living creature to hear. I was born from the hate, the hunger, the hollow in their hearts. I am the root, the seed, the first scream in the wood. She tried to back away, but the nursery around her melted. The walls turned into tendrils. The crib stretched upward like a mouth. She screamed as the floor opened and pulled her under again, this time not with violence, but with gravity, as if she were sinking into mud. The thing's voice followed her. 13. There must be 13. 13 souls to seal. You are the last. And then the darkness swallowed her whole again, and when she opened her eyes, she was standing in the hallway upstairs. The same hallway, the same cracked wallpaper, the same shadows twitching at the edge of her vision. But something had changed. Her reflection in the mirror across from her was smiling, and she wasn't. It was the fake Rebecca again, but now it looked fuller, more real. Its eyes gleamed with intelligence. It waved at her. "Time is folding," it whispered. "You're breaking apart." And then it stepped out of the mirror again. Not just an image, but flesh and blood. Real, tangible. It lunged and they collided, slamming into the wall. The house groaned violently, the walls weeping black tears. As they struggled, Rebecca grabbed the mirror shard still in her pocket from when the chamber exploded and drove it into the fake's chest. The thing howled, dissolving into smoke and screams. But from the smoke came voices, names, all 12 of them, the previous victims. They whispered, "One more, only one more. The house will sleep." Rebecca staggered back, staring at her bloodied hands. Her own voice now joined theirs, not in pain, but in warning. "Don't let it seal. Don't let it finish." She knew now. She wasn't the first. She was the last. If she died here, if the house claimed her, the loop would close. The entity would awaken fully, and the world outside would be next. She ran, down the hall, through the kitchen, into the foyer, but the front door was gone now. In its place was a wall of flesh, pulsating, breathing, waiting. Rebecca stared at the wall of flesh where the front door used to be, its surface heaving with every breath like a living organism, veins pulsing just beneath the skin, slick with a film of dark fluid that smelled of decay and something older. Primordial. She took a step back, her chest tightening, breath catching in her throat as the wall pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, as if sinking to her very life. Behind her, the air shimmered and distorted, whispering voices drifting through the corridors, voices that knew her name, her thoughts, her fears. They called to her, not to frighten, but to welcome. She turned slowly, and the house groaned in response, shifting around her, walls stretching, doorways folding into new shapes, the geometry of the house collapsing in on itself in impossible angles. The house was no longer obeying the rules of the real world. It was becoming something else, something ancient, sentient, and hungry. Rebecca ran. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if she were sprinting through a tunnel of bones, the sound bouncing back at her in whispers and laughter. She passed through rooms she didn't recognize anymore, rooms that hadn't been there before. A dining room with chairs hanging from the ceiling like upside-down teeth. A parlor with mirrors that showed her as an old woman, then a child, then as a creature with too many limbs. The floor shifted beneath her, becoming softer, more elastic, each step like running on wet skin. Suddenly she tripped, falling hard into a room that shouldn't have existed. A church. But it was twisted, broken, upside down, with pews nailed to the ceiling and an altar built from bones. Candles flickered blood-red flames, casting shadows that moved independent of the light. On the altar was a book, ancient and bound in skin. As she approached, the pages fluttered on their own, stopping at a page with a hand-drawn diagram, a circle of 13 figures surrounding a void. Her name was written beneath the last one, Rebecca, not in ink, but in something red and wet. A voice boomed above her. "You are the offering, the chosen, the last echo of the first scream." She spun around. At the back of the inverted church stood a figure draped in rags, its face obscured by a mask of flesh stitched together from many mouths. The mouths whispered in unison, their breath like rot. "The house was built from sorrow. It feeds on it. You were drawn here because you carry enough pain to awaken it." Rebecca shook her head. "Number, I didn't choose this. I didn't want any of this." The figure stepped forward, its many mouths twisting into what might have been a smile. "But you did. You came looking. You opened the door. You went deeper." And then it raised its hand. The pews fell from the ceiling, crashing around her. Rebecca dove behind the altar, the book clutched in her arms. It throbbed like a heart. She opened it again, flipping through the pages, desperate for anything that looked like a ritual, a banishment, a way out. And she found it. A page written in blood and bone dust, detailing the rite of severance. The only way to break the cycle. It required fire, blood, and the names of all 13. She only had 12. 12 names whispered by the mirror creature. The 13th was her own. She needed to give herself willingly, but that meant dying in the house, and if she did, the house won. Number, there had to be another way, a loophole. She looked up and saw the figure was gone, replaced by something worse, a mirror floating in the air, reflecting her, but not as she was. In the mirror, she was smiling again, her eyes black voids, her body covered in scars shaped like runes. The reflection spoke. You don't need to fight me. You are me. We are one. Let it happen. Become. Rebecca screamed and hurled the book at the mirror. It shattered with a high-pitched screech like metal on glass, and suddenly the church collapsed around her. She fell through the floor again, this time into water, freezing, thick water that clung to her skin like oil. She surfaced, gasping, in the flooded basement of the house. The water was black, thick with debris, floating bones, fragments of the house's past lives. Shapes moved beneath the surface. Faces, eyes, claws. She swam to the stairs only to find them half submerged and covered in slime. As she climbed, the water rose behind her, as if trying to pull her back. She barely escaped, crawling onto the main floor, soaked and shaking. And there in the living room stood someone else, a girl, pale, wide-eyed, maybe 10 years old, holding a stuffed rabbit with no face. The girl looked up at her and said, "You're not supposed to be here yet. You're too early. He's not finished building you." Rebecca tried to speak, but the girl turned and walked through a wall, literally through it, vanishing as if made of mist. Rebecca stumbled after her, slamming into the solid surface. Nothing there. Just old wallpaper that bled when she touched it. The whispers returned, louder now, more urgent. "He sees you. He's waking. You've stirred too much. You have to finish the circle or it will consume more than just this place." And then came the rumble, the sound of something massive shifting beneath the floorboards. The entire house shook violently and cracks split the walls, oozing black fluid and dust. Rebecca fell to her knees, and in that moment, she understood the truth. The house wasn't just a place. It was a cocoon, a shell, a womb, and something inside it, something monstrous and ancient, was trying to be born. All the people who'd entered before her, they weren't just victims. They were ingredients, pieces of a ritual. Rebecca was the final catalyst, the one who had to either complete the ritual or break it and risk releasing the thing unfinished into the world. She stood bloody and trembling and made her choice. She would find the names, she would gather the pieces, and she would burn the house to ash before it could finish becoming. But first she had to go back to the nursery, back to the thing in the crib, because deep in her bones she knew. It held the key to everything, and it was waiting. The nursery loomed ahead like a memory sharpened into a weapon. The door cracked open just enough to exhale a chill that smelled like wilted flowers and something faintly metallic, like old blood dried into fabric. Rebecca hesitated outside, every instinct screaming for her to run, but she couldn't. Not now, not when the answers were so close, tangled in whatever abomination waited inside the room that once belonged to a child. She pushed the door open. The hinges moaned like a dying thing, and the room was exactly as she remembered, except wrong in every way. The wallpaper, once faded yellow with stenciled giraffes and elephants, now moved in slow, nauseating waves like breathing skin. The mobile above the crib spun slowly despite the still air, each dangling object a malformed figure instead of stars and moons, miniature corpses twitching silently on string nooses. And in the crib, swaddled in black silk, was the thing. It wasn't a baby. Not anymore. Maybe not ever. Its eyes were too large, too black, with no whites. Its mouth was a slit that stretched from ear to ear, and when it opened it didn't cry. It hummed. Low, guttural, vibrating through the bones of the house and into Rebecca's chest like a tuning fork struck against her heart. She approached, hands shaking, whispering to herself, "It's just a symbol, a fragment, a piece of the ritual. It doesn't have power unless I give it power." But it was already powerful. Its presence was thick in the air, bending time and space around it. The mobile spun faster. The walls trembled. The crib cracked along its edges, like something inside was pressing outward. Rebecca reached into her coat and pulled out the book. It had somehow found its way back to her, even though she had thrown it away. Of course it had. The house wouldn't let it go. She flipped through the pages until she found the sigil of binding. It was simple, a circle with a split cross and 13 marks, one for each name. She traced the marks she had already identified in the book's flesh-like pages. 12 names, 12 souls consumed by the house. The last mark remained empty, her own. She could feel its pull, waiting to be inked in blood. She looked down at the creature in the crib. It had stopped humming. It was smiling now. "You don't have to die," it whispered in her voice. "Just become. Join the house. Join us." Rebecca recoiled, but the book's pages turned on their own, showing her something new, a hidden chapter, one that hadn't been visible before. The ritual of fracture, a way to disrupt the circle without completing it. But it required more than blood. It required memory, sacrifice, the severing of what made her her. Rebecca backed away from the crib, holding the book tightly, and fled the nursery. The house screamed around her, lights flashing, walls bleeding. It knew what she had seen. It knew she had a way out, and it would not let her leave. Doors slammed shut in her path. The floor twisted. Gravity shifted. At one point, she was climbing down a staircase that led upward into darkness. She passed through rooms she swore hadn't existed moments before. A ballroom filled with mirrors that showed her drowning, a kitchen where the stove belched ash and teeth, a bedroom where something slept beneath the mattress, whispering in a voice that sounded like her father. She ended up in the hallway with the portraits, the original 13. Their faces had changed. Now they looked at her, smiling, their eyes weeping black tears. She stared at the final empty frame. Her own reflection appeared in it, but twisted. Skin peeling, eyes hollow, a grin too wide. It blinked, and she felt it inside her head. "You cannot sever what is already entwined," it said. "We are already in you. You breathe us with every heartbeat." She screamed and tore the frame from the wall, smashing it on the floor. The glass exploded in a flash of white light, and when it faded, the house was silent. Still, waiting. Rebecca stood in the hallway clutching the book, and realized something had changed. A door at the end of the corridor, one she hadn't seen before, was now open. Behind it, stairs led downward, deeper than the basement, deeper than the foundation, into the roots of the house. She knew that was where she needed to go. That was where the source lived. Whatever birthed the house, whatever kept it alive, it waited in the dark beneath the bones of the land. Rebecca descended. The steps groaned under her weight, each one a heartbeat closer to something ancient. The air grew colder, thicker, the scent of mildew giving way to something older, cave dust, rust, and the copper tang of old blood. She emerged into a vast chamber. It shouldn't have existed beneath the house. It stretched too wide, too deep, lit by no source yet perfectly visible. In the center was a pit. Around it, 13 stone chairs, 12 occupied by corpses, each wearing a grin of death, their bones bound by roots growing from the stone itself. The 13th chair was empty, waiting for her. But behind the chairs, the wall pulsed. A great eye opened in the stone, lidless, watching. It saw her, truly saw her. And Rebecca fell to her knees, her mind cracking at the edges. She realized the house wasn't just a place, it was a shrine, a vessel. And the thing inside, watching from behind the wall, was the true master, a god of silence, of stillness, of decay. It had no name, only hunger. The house was its cathedral, the book, its Bible, and Rebecca was its prophet, or its sacrifice. She stood holding the book and walked toward the pit. The whispers had returned, louder now, not many voices. One, singular, all-consuming. Finish the circle, give the 13th, become. But she remembered the other ritual, the one that could break it. If she could unwrite the name, erase her identity, forget who she was entirely, the house would lose the final piece. She would become a null, a fracture. But to forget everything, to cast herself into the pit and strip away every memory, every shred of self, Was that not worse than death? She looked into the pit. It pulsed like a heartbeat, glowing red, beckoning. She raised the book. Read the words aloud. The ritual began. The words came out of Rebecca's mouth like smoke, thick, burning, impossible to control. As she spoke them, the letters in the book shifted beneath her fingers, slithering like worms, curling into new symbols that hadn't been there before. The chamber shook, the pit glowing brighter, pulsing in rhythm with her breath. The 13 chairs groaned in unison. The corpses twitched, bones cracked. One of them, the third from the left, lifted its head and opened its mouth, letting out a croaking hiss that sounded more like a memory than a voice. Stop. This. But she couldn't. She had crossed a threshold and now there was no going back. Her words were not her own anymore. They belonged to the thing in the wall, the silent God. The ritual pulled them from her lungs like a vacuum, each syllable cutting deeper into her identity, severing her from the memories that once defined her. Her name, Rebecca, began to fade, each letter crumbling like ash in the back of her mind. She tried to hold on to it, but it slipped away. She remembered her father's face, then forgot it. Her mother's voice echoed once and vanished. Her childhood home blinked from her thoughts like it had never existed. She clutched the book tighter, terrified now not of the thing in the wall, but of the nothingness inside her that was growing stronger with every breath. The ritual demanded everything. That was the price. That was the way to fracture the circle. She had to erase herself. The pit roared. A column of red light burst from its depths, striking the ceiling, illuminating the chamber in a blinding, searing light. The corpses in the chairs began to burn, their hollow grins melting, their bones turning to ash. The 13th chair trembled violently. The eye in the wall split into 3, then 5, then 13, all staring, all weeping dark fluid that hissed when it touched the stone. You defy the silence, the voices chorused from within her skull. You bring fracture, you bring ruin. Rebecca stumbled forward, collapsing at the edge of the pit, the book falling from her hands and landing open. The pages flipped rapidly, as if caught in a phantom wind, settling on one image, her own face, drawn in ink. Below it, the words, "The 13th shall choose." She reached out with shaking fingers, ready to tear the page free. But the pit reacted. Tendrils erupted from its center, slick, black, covered in tiny writhing mouths. They wrapped around her arms, her waist, her throat, lifting her from the ground. The air filled with a noise like screaming through water, a sound that stabbed into the brain and rattled her teeth. She tried to scream, but her voice was gone, stolen. The pit had taken her name, her memories, her voice. All that remained was instinct, fury, and will. Somewhere deep inside her, beneath the terror and the confusion, a spark remained, a refusal to surrender. With all her remaining strength, she thrust her hand forward and jammed her thumb into the page, into the drawing of her face. Blood smeared across the parchment. The book screamed, not audibly, in the mind, in the bones. The entire chamber convulsed. The pit hissed. The tendrils writhed in agony and dropped her. She hit the ground hard, coughing blood. The eye in the wall began to bulge, veins spreading across the stone, leaking black ichor that steamed and sizzled as it touched the floor. The corpses were gone now, reduced to dust. The chairs collapsed. The stone cracked. And in the silence that followed, something snapped. It was not a sound. It was the end of a tether, a string severed from reality. The ritual was broken. The circle fractured. The house had lost its grip. The pit began to collapse inward, the light vanishing, leaving behind only darkness. But it wasn't over. The God in the wall was not dead. It had only been wounded, and it would not let her go. Rebecca, if she could still call herself that, scrambled to her feet, clutching the book. The stairs were gone. The only path out was now a tunnel, wet, organic, like the throat of some dying beast. It pulsed with every heartbeat, lined with teeth and mucus, a grotesque birth canal leading away from the chamber. She had no choice. She ran. The tunnel swallowed her, squeezing her on all sides. the walls closing in, whispering to her in voices that mimicked her parents, her lovers, her lost friends. Come back, stay, let it finish, let it make you whole again. She shut her eyes, crawling, dragging herself forward until suddenly, air. She burst through a wooden floor into a different room of the house. It was the parlor, where it had all started. The house was in ruins now. The walls groaned, bleeding black slime. Windows shattered on their own. Fire erupted from cracks in the floor. But something else was wrong. Outside the windows was not night, not day, but a roiling sky of static and screaming shadows. The house was no longer in the real world. It had been pulled into a pocket of the god's own making, a purgatory, a prison, a trap. She ran from room to room, searching for an exit, but every door led to more madness, a staircase that only descended, never ended, a kitchen where knives floated in the air, pointing at her, a hallway filled with whispering dolls nailed to the ceiling. The house was dying, and it was taking her with it. Then she saw it, in the foyer, a mirror, but not like the others. This one was broken, shattered down the middle, and inside it was a door, a real door, her way out. But to reach it, she had to pass through the god's heart. She turned around, and there it stood, no longer hidden in stone or pit, the god of silence, towering, limbless, mouthless, covered in eyes that bled. Its presence crushed the room, bent the air, silenced all thought. It didn't move toward her. It didn't have to. It simply looked. And as it looked, her mind buckled. Blood ran from her nose, her ears, her eyes. She screamed, but no sound came. She held up the book like a shield. It caught fire in her hands. Pages blackened. Ink bled. She threw it at the god, and it stopped, just for a moment. Enough. She turned and hurled herself into the mirror. Glass cut her skin, tore her clothes, but she passed through, out the other side, onto grass, real grass. She was outside, in the woods, the house behind her, screaming, collapsing, burning with unnatural fire, imploded in silence. Then, nothing. No sound, no wind, just morning sunlight, and her lying on the ground, covered in blood, alive, alone, free. Maybe, or maybe just in another part of its dream. The sun was pale and weak through the thick canopy of twisted trees. Rebecca lay on the damp forest floor, her breath ragged, skin slick with cold sweat and blood. The sharp sting of cuts on her arms and face told her she had survived the mirror's shards, but barely. Around her, the woods were silent, oppressively still. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just an eerie void of sound. She pushed herself up, knees sinking into the wet earth, and looked back. The clearing where the house once stood was gone. No ash, no rubble, nothing but empty ground and gnarled roots, as if the house had never existed. She felt the weight of the night's horrors pressing against her mind, the voices of the gods still whispering in the dark corners of her thoughts. She had escaped the chamber, the ritual, the god's immediate grasp, but the thing was not finished with her. That much was certain. Every instinct screamed that the house's evil was stitched into her skin now, coursing through her veins. The book was gone, the only link to the ritual and the god's power. But what remained in her was something far worse. A whisper, a hunger, a secret voice that called to her in moments of silence. She staggered to her feet, every step a war against exhaustion. Ahead, the woods opened to a dirt road, worn, cracked, and lined with broken telephone poles that bent like crooked fingers against the sky. She knew she had to leave, find help, find answers. But where? The nearest town, Black Hollow, was miles away, and it had its own dark history, stories told in hushed tones about disappearances, strange lights, and cursed ground. She had to go there. Pulling her coat tighter around her trembling frame, she started down the road. The sky darkened despite the hour, thick clouds rolling in like a storm. Her shadow stretched long and flickered, as if something followed behind her, just beyond sight. As she walked, memories began to claw back, fragments of her past life before the house, faces she barely recognized. A man's laughter, a child's cry. But with each step, the shadows grew heavier and the whispers louder. They weren't just in her mind anymore. They floated in the air, drifting just out of reach, words half heard and full of menace. You cannot run. You belong here. Hours passed. The road twisted like a serpent, cutting deeper into the wilderness. Suddenly, headlights blazed behind her, a truck roaring down the road. She leapt into the ditch, heart pounding, mud splattering her face. The truck sped past, windows dark, the driver unseen. But Rebecca could feel eyes watching from inside. She kept moving, faster now, desperation fueling her legs. Then the road ended at the edge of town. Black Hollow lay sprawled before her, a collection of weathered buildings, a gas station closed for years, empty streets choked with overgrown weeds. The town felt dead, or worse, sleeping under a curse. She had no choice but to enter. The first building she saw was a small diner, windows grimy, the sign flickering weakly. Maggie's. She pushed open the door. Inside was stale and cold, empty except for a man sitting in a booth. He looked up as she entered. An older man with sunken eyes, face lined with years of hard living. You don't look like you're from around here, he said softly. Not anymore, she whispered. She told him a fractured story about the house, the ritual, the God in the wall. He listened without interruption, eyes never leaving hers. When she finished, he nodded slowly. You've been touched by the old curse, he said. Not many make it out alive, and fewer still with their minds intact. She asked if there was a way to fight it, to break the hold the God had on her. He looked toward the window, where shadows shifted unnaturally. There is a way, he said, but it's dangerous. You'll need to go back to the source, the Black Hollow Church. It's been abandoned for decades, but the curse started there, and maybe it's where it can end. Rebecca nodded, fear gnawing at her heart. Returning to the cursed ground was madness, but staying lost, haunted, and hunted was worse. The man slid a worn map across the table. Take this, he said. Be careful. The shadows are stronger than ever. She pocketed the map and left the diner. The town's streets felt alive now, with eyes watching, whispers trailing her steps. As night fell again, the stars vanished, swallowed by the darkness that crept in from every corner. She had one goal: reach the church, confront whatever waited there, and end this nightmare once and for all. But the house's curse wasn't just a place, it was inside her now. And the closer she got to the source, the more the darkness clawed to claim her. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled once. The sound echoed like a death knell, signaling the beginning of the final battle. The air grew heavier with each step as Rebecca followed the cracked dirt path leading out of Black Hollow Town. The map clenched tightly in her hand was worn and faded, edges frayed from years of neglect. But it was her only guide to the church, a place whispered about in hushed tones, long abandoned, steeped in legends of dark rituals and vanished souls. Shadows gathered beneath the twisted trees lining the path, their branches scraping like skeletal fingers against the night sky. Every rustle and distant snap made her heart hammer painfully against her ribs. The whispers from the house still lingered in her mind, a low, ceaseless murmur threatening to drown her sanity. She forced herself forward, each footfall crunching on dead leaves until the twisted spire of the old church rose out of the fog like a jagged tooth. Its wooden walls were blackened with rot and stained glass windows shattered, gaping holes yawning where saints and angels once glowed in light. The heavy oak doors stood slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. She hesitated on the threshold, a cold wave of dread crashing over her. Inside, the smell of mold and decay was overpowering, thick with the scent of forgotten prayers and spilled blood. She took out the book, but the pages were charred and blank, her link to the ritual destroyed in the house's collapse. Whatever magic it once held had vanished, leaving only questions and shadows. As she stepped inside, the temperature plummeted, breath visible in the freezing air. The floorboards moaned beneath her weight, and the walls seemed to close in, whispering secrets she dared not understand. At the altar, something glimmered, a rusty metal box with arcane symbols carved into its surface. With trembling hands, she pried it open. Inside lay an assortment of strange relics, bone fragments, withered flowers, and a cracked mirror shard. The one from the house, she realized, still humming with dark power. She picked it up, the cold biting into her skin. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Darkness poured from the corners of the room, coalescing into a shape, an enormous shadow with glowing eyes that burned with malice. "You returned," it hissed, voice like shattered glass. "But you cannot undo what has been done." Panic surged through Rebecca, but she stood her ground, clutching the mirror shard. The shadow lunged, and the battle between light and darkness began, the ancient curse clawing at her soul, trying to consume her from within. The fight was brutal, a whirlwind of fear and fury, memories and nightmares swirling like a tempest. She was losing, the shadows tightening their grip, when suddenly a voice broke through the chaos, soft, familiar, and real. "Fight, Rebecca. Remember who you are." It was the man from the diner, standing in the doorway, holding an old lantern glowing with warm light. He stepped forward, chanting words in a language older than the town itself. The shadows recoiled, shrieking as the light burned through their forms. The church trembled, stones cracking, windows shattering further. The altar shattered, and the metal box exploded into a cloud of ashes and dust. In the sudden silence, Rebecca felt the darkness within her loosen, pulling back like a tide retreating. She collapsed to her knees, gasping, the mirror shard slipping from her grasp and falling into the ash. The man knelt beside her, eyes soft but weary. "You've broken part of the curse," he said, "but it is not over. The God you faced in the house still watches. Its hunger grows." She nodded weakly, knowing this was just another battle in a war she could barely understand. But now she had an ally, and a purpose. Together they would face the darkness, and maybe, just maybe, survive. Rebecca felt the weight of exhaustion crushing her, every muscle aching as she sat on the cold stone floor of the ruined church. The faint glow from the old lantern the man held flickered against the cracked walls, casting long, trembling shadows that seemed to move on their own. Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows, carrying distant cries that sounded neither human nor animal. She barely registered the sound, focused instead on the burning ache deep inside her chest, the echo of the dark god's hunger, still gnawing at her soul. The man whose name she had learned was Elias began to explain what she had just faced. The god was no mere spirit or demon. It was an ancient entity, older than the town itself, bound to the land through rituals long forgotten by history. The house on Black Hollow Road had been its prison and altar, a place where the god's influence seeped into the world. When Rebecca and her friends had unwittingly disturbed the site, the god had awakened, reaching out with a hunger that threatened to consume everything. Elias told her of the old legends, that the god was a shadow of despair, feeding on fear, pain, and lost souls. It could not be destroyed, only contained, but the ritual to do so required sacrifice and resolve beyond mortal strength. "You're marked now," Elias said quietly. "The god's power runs through you, but it also means you have the power to fight it." She clenched her fists, the memory of the shattered mirror shard burning faintly in her mind. "What must I do?" she asked, voice barely more than a whisper. Elias handed her a small worn amulet carved with symbols she didn't recognize. "This will protect you. Hold the god at bay when the hunger grows. But to seal it, you must return one last time. To the heart of the town, to the well beneath the old cemetery. That is where the curse began." The thought of descending into the dark, damp well made her stomach churn, but she nodded. There was no turning back now. The god's shadows would come for her, again and again, unless she ended it. As they left the church, the air grew colder, and the fog thickened, wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. The streets of Black Hollow were eerily silent, buildings looming like silent sentinels watching their every move. They made their way to the cemetery on the hill, a place of cracked tombstones and broken crosses, where the earth seemed restless. At the center, an ancient well yawned, open, black and endless. "Be careful," Elias warned. "The well is a gateway. The god's power flows from there. The shadows will be strongest." Rebecca gripped the rope ladder and began her descent, the cold stone walls closing in around her. Below, the air was thick with the scent of earth and rot. Strange symbols were carved into the stones surrounding the well's base, symbols of protection and binding. As she reached the bottom, a sudden movement caught her eye. Shadows twisted and writhed, forming shapes of those lost to the god's hunger, ghostly figures reaching out with hollow eyes. The god's whispers filled the chamber, promising power, release, and oblivion. Her heart pounded, but she raised the amulet, and a soft light blossomed, pushing back the darkness. The shadows recoiled but not defeated. The battle was far from over. Rebecca knew that to seal the god's curse, she would have to face the deepest fear inside herself, the fear of losing her soul to the darkness forever. The air in the well was thick with a suffocating darkness, pressing down on Rebecca like a physical weight as she stood at the bottom, clutching the amulet tightly. The ghostly figures circling her were more than just shadows now. They bore the faces of those who had vanished in Black Hollow, twisted by the god's insatiable hunger into eternal prisoners of despair. Their hollow eyes pleaded, screamed silently for release or vengeance. As their cold hands reached for her, the amulet's light flared, pushing back the grasping phantoms with a burning intensity that seared her skin. But for every shadow banished, two more seemed to emerge from the cracks in the stone. Elias's voice echoed faintly from above, urging her to focus, to remember why she had come. The ritual to bind the god required more than courage. It demanded sacrifice. Rebecca's mind raced as the shadows tightened their circle, their whispers turning to angry wails. The god's hunger pulsed through the well's depths, a living thing, a darkness that wanted to consume not just her body, but her very soul. She dropped to her knees, eyes shut tight, and reached deep inside herself for the strength Elias had spoken of, the strength to face the fear that lurked within. Memories flashed, her friends laughing before the nightmare, the house's malevolent presence, the broken mirror shard, and the faces of those lost to the darkness. She remembered the promise she made to herself and to those who had disappeared. She would end this nightmare, no matter the cost. With renewed resolve, she began to chant the ancient words Elias had taught her, her voice steady despite the cold that wrapped around her like icy chains. The amulet glowed brighter, casting the well in a pale, ethereal light. The shadows screamed, swirling faster, their forms becoming more twisted, desperate. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath her, and the god's presence surged, a massive wave of despair and hunger crashing down like a storm. Rebecca's knees buckled, and for a terrifying moment, she felt the darkness slipping inside her, cold fingers clawing at her mind. But she fought back, raising the amulet high. A beam of pure light shot upward, piercing the darkness like a spear. The well shook violently, stones crumbling, the air filled with the screams of the god and the shadows as they were drawn into the amulet's light. Then silence. The well fell still, the shadows gone, the oppressive weight lifted. Rebecca collapsed, gasping for breath, the amulet now dim and cracked, its power nearly spent. She heard footsteps descending the ladder. Elias. He helped her up, eyes shining with a mix of relief and sorrow. "It's done," he said quietly, "for now. But the god's hunger is eternal. We've bought time, but the darkness will always be waiting." Rebecca nodded, knowing the fight was far from over. The curse had been contained, but the scars it left would never fully heal. Together they climbed out of the well, stepping back into the cold night air. The first hints of dawn colored the horizon, casting light on the town of Black Hollow, a town that seemed to breathe easier, if only for a moment. But in the shadows beyond, the god watched, waiting for its next chance to feed. The morning sun barely pierced the thick fog that clung to Black Hollow as Rebecca and Elias emerged from the well. The town seemed suspended in a fragile silence, as if holding its breath after the night's horrors. But Rebecca could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching from every cracked window and shadowed alley. They walked slowly back toward the diner, the only place that still felt safe. But Rebecca knew the god's presence lingered like a poison in the air. Elias spoke in hushed tones about the history buried beneath the town's foundations, how generations had made pacts with dark forces for power and protection, unwittingly binding the god's hunger to their land. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. The curse was a living wound, fed by fear and forgotten sins, and Black Hollow was its heart. Rebecca's mind swirled with the faces of those lost, the friends she could no longer save, the innocent trapped by shadows. The amulet's faint glow was a fragile barrier, but even its light had limits. They needed allies, others who understood the darkness and were willing to fight. As they entered the diner, the bell above the door jingled sharply, drawing the eyes of a few tired patrons. Elias nodded toward a corner booth where a woman sat alone, her eyes sharp and wary. "This is Claire," he said. "She's been hunting the darkness in Black Hollow longer than anyone else." Claire's gaze met Rebecca's, a mixture of caution and recognition. "You've stirred the shadows," she said. "They're restless now, more dangerous than ever." The three of them huddled over a battered table, sharing stories and plans. Claire revealed ancient texts and rituals, knowledge passed down through generations of those who dared to challenge the god's curse. But the deeper they dug, the more Rebecca realized the stakes. To truly end the hunger, the town's darkest secrets would need to be exposed, sins buried beneath decades of lies, betrayal, and sacrifice. And in doing so, they would awaken forces that might destroy them all. Night fell again, heavier and more suffocating than before. Rebecca felt the god's hunger gnawing at her resolve, whispering promises of power and oblivion. The battle was no longer just about survival. It was about reclaiming the soul of Black Hollow itself. Together they prepared for the final confrontation, knowing that what awaited in the shadows could break them or save them. As the clock struck midnight, Rebecca stood at the edge of the town, staring into the darkness that stretched beyond the trees. The god was watching, waiting, and this time it was coming for her. The night was thick with silence as Rebecca, Elias, and Claire gathered at the edge of Black Hollow's ancient forest, where the god's influence was strongest. The trees loomed like giants, their twisted branches scratching at the sky, and a cold wind whispered through the leaves, carrying voices from the past. Anguished cries, broken promises, and desperate pleas for redemption. Armed with the knowledge, the amulet, and a determination forged in fear and loss, they stepped into the darkness, each step a battle against the oppressive weight pressing on their souls. The deeper they ventured, the more the shadows came alive, swirling around them in a tempest of despair and rage. Figures emerged, faces of those consumed by the god's hunger, their eyes empty voids reflecting the torment of the cursed land. Rebecca felt the darkness clawing at her heart, trying to drag her into oblivion, but the amulet pulsed with a fierce light, anchoring her to the world of the living. They reached a clearing where the ground was cracked and barren, the remnants of an ancient altar stained with blood and shadow. This was the heart of the curse, the place where the pact had been sealed centuries ago. Elias began the ritual, chanting words in a forgotten tongue, while Claire circled the altar, drawing protective sigils with chalk and salt. Rebecca stood at the center, holding the amulet high, willing its light to burn away the darkness. The god's fury erupted like a storm, shaking the earth, tearing at the sky, and howling with a voice that shattered bones and hearts alike. The shadows surged forward in a desperate final assault, but the trio held their ground, bound by courage and sacrifice. As the ritual reached its climax, the amulet shattered, releasing a blinding light that surged outward, engulfing the clearing and spilling into the forest. The darkness screamed, then began to unravel, the cursed shadows dissolving into nothingness, leaving behind only silence and the faint scent of rain. Exhausted but victorious, Rebecca, Elias, and Claire watched as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, bathing Black Hollow in warmth and hope. The curse was lifted, the god's hunger finally stilled, and the town's wounds began to heal. But the scars remained, a reminder of the darkness that had once consumed them, and the courage it took to fight back. Rebecca knew the shadows might one day return, but so would she, ready to stand against the night. As the sun rose higher, illuminating the quiet streets of Black Hollow, she whispered a promise to the wind, to never forget, to never surrender, and to keep the light alive, for herself, for her friends, and for the souls lost to the darkness. The house at Black Hollow Road stood silent now, empty and broken, a monument to the battle fought and won. But in the stillness, a faint echo lingered, a whisper of the untold stories waiting to be heard.